Okay, welcome back everybody to the Murmurations podcast. Today's guest is my colleague, Dr. Sarah Hill. Morning, Sarah.
Morning.
Sarah is a lecturer in media and cultural studies in our subject area at Newcastle University in media culture heritage. And Sarah is going to talk to us today about her research in media and cultural studies, and specifically on disability. And before we get into any detail, just what I tend to do with all guests is just you give us a quick run through of your background and research and teaching interests and motivations for kind of studying what you study.
Well, my background is in media and film studies. So I would define my research interests broadly as feminist media studies, girlhood, and disability. And disability is the latest addition to my research. I started with my PhD at UEA looking at young femininity and contemporary British cinema, which I'll probably come back to a bit later. But my work more recently at Newcastle is developing work around the intersections between girlhood, gender and disability and social media.
There's a lot that we could talk about in your research, but we were going to focus today on the stuff that you're doing about disability, both in terms of media coverage of disability and the kind of public discourse around disability. What do you want to talk about the project that you're currently working on in relation to the self-representation of disabled girls?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a project that I've loosely titled Disabled Girlhood. And what I'm interested there is how gendered identities and disabled identities intersect through disabled young women's self-representation practices on social media. And the reason why I'm interested in this is because you quite often find that disability becomes the sort of overarching identity for a disabled person, and it subsumes other identity categories like gender, class and race into the background, and disability becomes the main focus. And I wanted to look at how these identities intersect, so what it means to be a girl who is disabled at that intersection. And obviously we know that young people live their lives within and through social media. So I thought it was a really useful way of looking at how they present themselves and how they live their lives.
Yeah. We were talking before about the tensions between people, the tensions between how the medical community diagnose people with disability and how people with disability understand the position that they're in, either because they haven't got a diagnosis or because they don't want the diagnosis that they have necessarily. And you do some research, or you're looking at the way in which people talk about this kind of stuff in terms of self-representation as well, aren't you?
Yes, so basically in disability studies there tends to be two models of disability. One is the medical model of disability that says somebody can't do something because of this impairment and there's something wrong with them. So it's a very negative framing of disability, which we've tried to move away from over the years. And then there's the preferred model, which is the social model, which says that a person is disabled by society and unequal access. So the obvious example of this is if you take a wheelchair user and put them in an environment that's completely level access, then they can just go about their daily lives quite freely. But if you take away the lift and just leave a set of stairs, then they're disabled by that poor access because they can't access the things that non-disabled people can.
Yeah.
So within the project, I have to consider, basically I'm working with a self-identification form of disability, so I'm not relying on diagnostics to identify the girls as disabled. It's up for them to define themselves as such.
Right.
But it's often quite a tricky area because there are people who feel disabled but can't get a medical diagnosis to support that, so they don't get the right access to the support that they need.
Sure.
And there are people who are medically defined as having a disability, but they don't identify as being disabled because it's still a stigmatized identity and it has negative connotations still.
Yeah, okay.
For a lot of people.
You've explained that very clearly in a way that I was trying to get out a minute ago, and I couldn't make it clear at all. So I think that's really important because I don't think that's a familiar tension. Or they are complexities that I don't think would be familiar to a lot of people outside of the area of research that you do, and you know, people who just aren't close to this kind of experience in a day-to-day context. That idea that you can have the difficulty of carrying a disability that either can't be diagnosed or has been diagnosed, but it's still the social stigma and around it that people would prefer to try to not have to kind of carry as a kind of social baggage. One thing that we've also talked about before was, which I was interested in, was how there is growing attention and a more to disability and a more constructive public discourse around disability, and more efforts to be inclusive and so on. But it always makes me wonder whether we say the right things and do the right symbolic things and try to promote the right ethos through media and public discourse and so on, but whether that experience really translates into anything for people who have difficulties on a daily basis that a lot of us don't even think about. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. I think there has been more sort of representational attention paid to disability, but I do think it's only certain kinds of disabled people who are coming through there. So sort of people who are more their kind of impairment or their form of disability is more easily recognizable and understood. So for example, a wheelchair user is more easily understood than someone with a hidden disability or with a sort of more neurodiverse identity. So it does depend on the type of impairment. And also I think that while this representational visibility is very helpful, we can see on a day-to-day level that government policy does not support disabled people
Adequately enough.
Exactly. So we've seen it particularly since sort of 2008, the financial crash. Disabled people became the folk devils of austerity. So there was a lot of discourse, particularly around the sort of right-wing press, like the Daily Mail, about so-called benefit scroungers and people taking off the state at a time when the state supposedly didn't have any money. And this had very real-life consequences for a lot of disabled people whose support was cut back even further. Frances Ryan, the Guardian journalist, has written a really good book about this called Crippled, where she interviews a lot of disabled people and their sort of lived experiences of disability in this period. And there are some shocking and dire situations within the book. And we're seeing it even now with COVID, to sort of bring it up to date. There was a lot of discourse about people who deserve medical treatment in an emergency situation at a time when the NHS was possibly going to be at capacity. So there's a lot of concern amongst many disabled people and their families that those with more severe disabilities would not get prioritised for ventilator intervention if they got COVID, and what that would mean for them.
This is something that really frustrates me, that previous point that you were talking about in relation to austerity as well, especially, is that I think that the vast majority of people, if they actually saw the day-to-day suffering that people experience, that regardless of what we say about how people vote and whether that means that you're good or bad or whatever, the vast majority of people, if they really knew the truth and they could see people's situations, they would say, we should help that person, or we should help these people. But this is why the stories that we tell as a society and the stories that we're fed, particularly about the welfare state, are so problematic, because this isn't about just whinging and moaning and looking after scroungers and so on. These are really lived experiences and realities on the ground that people, I don't think people are saying, I don't care about the disabled. But the tragic thing about this is because I think people do care, but they're being fed stories that lead them to believe that most of this money is spent on things that it's not spent on. Most of it really does go towards helping people who really need to be helped, and they don't get that help when we have this really unhelpful public discourse around welfare.
Yeah, and particularly around productivity as well, because we live in these neoliberal capitalist times. Disabled people are seen as much less productive than non-disabled people, when actually, you know, we've seen now how flexible working patterns really make a difference, and if that support was available, disabled people make huge contributions to the economy, but obviously the discourse around that doesn't reflect that. And I think you're right, a lot of people aren't saying let's not help disabled people. It's they think it's kind of, oh, we don't mean you, we mean the other ones. But you know, who are the other ones? When benefit fraud cases, for example, the figure is something like 0.5%, like it's really, really tiny, and everyone else is sort of genuinely sort of they fit the criteria for those benefits. So.
Yeah, I mean, one question I've got for you actually has just come to mind, is that I heard somebody who was a retired Dutch footballer there was a conversation during it was an international football tournament. I think they were talking about disability in football, and he was using the term differently abled. And now I wasn't sure what I wanted to ask you what you think about that term, because on the one hand, I could tell that he was trying to make a point that some disabled people can contribute, and it's not that they're not, you know, they're less worthy in that way that you just said about working and capitalism and so on. He was trying to make the point that that these people can contribute in other ways, but equally in that terms of that social model you were talking about earlier on, there's a danger that what is supposed to be quite a helpful progressive term could actually undermine a real problem, because you're trying to say, well, because of the social kind of structures and conditions, it's not differently abled, it is disabled, because you're not accommodating for people's disabilities.
Yes, that's exactly right. I mean, I spend a lot of time looking at disabled communities on the internet as part of my research, and the term differently able does not go down well in those spaces for that reason. So if we say differently abled, it again puts the onus on the individual to fit in and sort of see themselves that way. Whereas when we use the word disabled, we're acknowledging that there are structural inequalities that need to be addressed in order to ensure full participation. Yeah.
I think this is why these conversations are really important, because that was a really good example of somebody who was felt like they were trying to push the conversation forward and had the best intentions and was trying to be constructive, and actually, because of those social conditions you're talking about, it doesn't have the meaning of that's intended in a lived kind of experience on a day-to-day sense.
I think it stems as well from this idea of disability being so stigmatized and people being very fearful of disability. So I think when people try and use terms like differently able, they think they're being helpful because they assume that one wouldn't want to be disabled and that it's a negative identity, when actually people in the disability community very much take take ownership of their disabled identity and see it as a significant aspect of their identity. Without it, they wouldn't be the person they are.
Yeah, yeah. So that it's almost saying, don't worry, I'm not sitting here feeling sorry for myself. I would just like you to make some basic changes that will enable me to be included.
Yes.
It doesn't sound very difficult at all when we talk about it like that, but it's surprising how much lag there is between the things that we're doing in what you said earlier, a representational way that is all done with the best of intentions, and the lived experience in a day-to-day sense. I think that's a really important thing to draw attention to in these kinds of conversations. On that point, there was something we talked about before, which again I was interested in, the example of the Paralympics. So the way in which, and again, it's not about being doom and gloom, in case anybody listening thinking, oh, we're trying to do all these great things and you're looking for problems. It's not that. But the Paralympics was a standout example for me as something that's really spectacular and really great. And it's not just this kind of tag on thing that's just done just to look progressive or be politically correct or something. It is this brilliant sporting spectacle, and there are superstars in there who the public absolutely love, and it's a phenomenal thing. But is there a danger sometimes that these things, these spectacular events happen, and these really big, brilliant things are a success, and then we think, oh, well, it's great, we're doing really well, but actually, again, that day-to-day experience is almost more frustrating, because it's like, I need to get to work. It's like, it's great, you've got the Olympics, but I need to get to work, sort of thing.
Yes, I mean, if I start with the positives of the Paralympics, I think it is great to showcase disability sport on the main stage alongside the Olympians. And I think Channel 4 did a really good job in 2012 of making it just as big as the Olympic coverage and really integrating it into their schedule. So those Paralympians like Johnny Peacock and Hannah Cock became household names in the same way as like Mo Farah or Jess Ennis and those kind of stars. So I think the increased awareness of the Paralympics has been very good over the last few years, but it is, as you said, a bit of an issue in that it's how most audiences are introduced to disability outside of their own lived experience. So it does create this bit of an idea. There's a term in disability studies called the supercrip, and the Paralympian falls into this category because the supercrip is either an example of a disabled person getting praised for doing very ordinary things that other people think they aren't able to do, or a disabled person who is held up for doing excessive, really extravagant things like the Paralympics. I mean, that is a feat that most disabled people cannot meet. Because it takes years of training and years of skill, and it's not part of everyone's lives. And it's also not what all disabled people want to achieve either. And I think I've had conversations with people about this before. There's more emphasis on disability sport, but sometimes I think at the expense of other activities, and not everybody wants to be involved in sports in that sort of way. But it becomes the sort of default representational way that people understand disability, I think.
Yeah. When we were talking about the Olympics as well, I just thought of the last leg as well, because what Channel 4 did was quite good in the way that it wasn't just about the sporting spectacle. It was that move into kind of popular culture afterwards as well. And that show has been really successful. And you could tell me if I'm wrong, but this is just from my perspective as an audience member. They seem to have they tread a very careful line, and they somehow have managed to kind of relax the atmosphere and environment and conversation around disability a little bit. through their own kind of sense of humour and the way in which they kind of mock at each other and so on, but not in this kind of inhumane or brutal sense. Well, that's from my perspective, but what from your perspective, what do you think about The Last Leg?
I agree. I actually really like The Last Leg. I think they've done well to make it transition from being a sort of Paralympic tie-in to being its own standalone show now.
Yeah.
And I think the way they use humour to approach, well, not just disability, but social issues in general is very clever, while also raising awareness. I think they do very good politically charged monologues on the show as well.
That
really highlight sort of general everyday political issues.
When they stop, they'll kind of pause the humour for a minute and they'll make a serious point about something, and it's quite powerful sometimes.
We can't knock it because it's bringing disability to a mainstream audience on a Friday night.
Excellent. I mean, one other thing that I wanted to ask you was, clearly from what we're talking about, there's significant public interest in this topic, and there's a growing conversation around it, and there are significant issues to address between the kind of the representational side of the media that we've talked about and the experience that we've also discussed for people in a day-to-day sense. But given that, why is it then that our fields of research, and particularly critical research, don't seem to have, there doesn't seem to be as much published or talked about in terms of disability, or if there is, it certainly isn't on my radar in the same way that other topics are. If that's the case, why do you think that is?
I think it's partly, if we're talking about media studies, partly because disabled people are so underrepresented anyway in the text that we study. It doesn't come up a huge amount, and I think a lot of it is drawn from experience. So, I'm a disabled researcher. I probably wouldn't be doing this research if I wasn't disabled myself, because I don't think these kind of ideas occur to people more generally. And I think a lot of researchers will, if you really press them on it, will say their research stems out of sort of personal interests and their own experiences in some way, which we then take on and develop. So I think unless you have a lot of experience of disability, you're not likely to be drawn to it as a field of research.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point, because it's the importance of inclusivity. It's not that we can just turn our attention to topics that aren't covered enough and then just cover them. Of course, that can help, but it doesn't really fulfill the task required, because then you have people leading on things that they can't fully appreciate from a kind of lived experience, which is such a valid insight. So I think it's a really good point. I've got lots of beeping going on in my headphones. I don't know whether that's coming through or not, but apologies if it is. Did you want to talk about your other project as well, which is kind of going back in time a little bit, but your PhD that's now feeding into your current book that you're writing with Bloomsbury?
Yes. The book is out now, actually. The ebook version is out now, and the hardback is coming in a few weeks' time. I think the press was slightly delayed by COVID, but it is coming. So it's called Young Women, Girls and Postfeminism in Contemporary British Film. And this is based on my PhD research at UEA, and really where my interest in girlhood properly started. So I look in the book at a range of contemporary British films between 2000 and 2015, and I'm particularly interested in how discourses of girlhood are mediated within these texts and their critical reception, so film review discourse as well, and also how these films mediate discourses of post-feminism, which is often seen as a transnational concept. And it is to a large extent, but I argue in the book that it can be sort of modified and articulated within national frameworks, and a British articulation of post-feminism has its own characteristics.
Right.
So the two that I look at in particular, one takes the idea of the post-feminist makeover, which we see in a lot of Hollywood films as the woman gets made over into the ideal feminine subject. And what we see in these British films is this kind of ambivalence towards makeover. So because it's a contemporary trope, they do include it, but they don't fully commit to it, because the post-feminist makeover typically relies on consumption and glamour. And the British discourse and British identity is very sort of skeptical of this idea of glamour, because it's seen as a very American characteristic, whereas British femininity is seen as more natural and fresh-faced, and not consumerist in the same way. And the second main characteristic is related to class, which is a defining feature of British identity in a way that it's possibly not in the US. So because the neoliberal post-feminist the ideal neoliberal post-feminist subject is supposed to be classless or middle class, there's a tension there, because British texts do focus a lot on sort of working class identity and class struggle. So we see that characters in some films are not able to overcome their class identity and become sort of ideal post-feminist girls in some, but not in others. So it depends on the target audience for the film. So if I looked at in one of the chapters at teen sports films, like sort of Fast Girls and Shallow Girl and Bend It Like Beckham would be one of the earlier examples that could be included there. And in these kind of glossy aspirational sports films, the working class protagonist is able to overcome their working class status and sort of gain entry into middle class lifestyle, but this isn't always possible depending on the sort of genre of film and the target audience.
Right.
But the fact that class is so prominently featured, I think, is a very British characteristic, because a lot of contemporary British films see class as more of a barrier to success than race, for example, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. When you made that comparison between the US and the UK and US as well, that reminded me of a study that my supervisor did years and years and years ago. Justin Lewis did when he was in America on the Cosby Show. And in relation to class and race in a US context, they were asked to do this project to look at the Cosby Show and to show how I think there was the expectation that this research would be done to show how progressive this show was and so on and so forth. But actually this content analysis they did of it came out as really critical, and it was saying, well, actually this program's a reinforcement of the American dream, because the structural problems and struggles and obstacles that that American communities face in terms of race and class aren't reflected. It's just, well, this lot have got here. There's this doctor and living in this massive house. They've got here and they've realised the dream, and this is what America is, and this is what you can do. When in reality, that's not how it works. So I think, if I remember rightly, I think I think Bill Cosby was really quite pissed off about it, but it was like, well, that's what the analysis showed. So but yeah, I think that's in a book called The Ideological Octopus, if I remember rightly.
I'll have to look at that.
Yeah,
I've seen similar things in my research, because obviously the films I was looking at, most of them came out during the New Labour period, particularly if they were sort of the sports films or sort of teen films set in London. It was this idea of the sort of metropolitan city where dreams can come true, and you know, if you work hard you can achieve your goals, and there's no sort of social inequality in that those kind of discourses that were a particular feature of the New Labour period as well.
That's really, really interesting. In terms of one thing I wanted us to cover as well, just moving on from your PhD, you've done brilliantly as an early career researcher. Now we often talk about the concerns, quite rightly as well, talk about the concerns and the difficulties and the anxieties and struggles of being an early career researcher and making that break in academia, getting those opportunities and then making the most of them with all the multiple things that you have to juggle. Do you want to talk about a bit about your experience as an early career researcher, and also just dish out any bits of advice that you think are little nuggets that people could do with if they're listening as early career researchers or people doing their PhDs?
Well, I think any advice I give is very much with the caveat that a lot of it is dependent on sort of your economic situation and your financial situation, because there obviously is this pressure to just take any job because we all need to pay rent.
Yes.
So I do think that needs to be kept in mind when giving advice to ECRs, because some are able to pursue things in ways that others aren't. I think I just think I've been very privileged in academia so far. I was very lucky I didn't get caught in the sort of cycle of teaching fellowships and hourly paid work for more than about a year. So I think that really helped me stay on the research track through the early career fellowship that I came to Newcastle for.
That was a long trip as well, from Norwich to Newcastle.
Via Cardiff.
Via Cardiff, of course. Yeah.
I mean, it was difficult at times. I don't want to gloss over it too much, because there was a year after my PhD graduation where I had to go and live with my parents because my hourly paid work didn't pay enough to actually rent anywhere. So I think, you know, we have to bear that in mind as well. If someone was looking at my trajectory, it looks quite smooth, but there were sort of those other factors coming into it as well.
Again, the difference between the story and the experience.
Yeah. But again, I'm very fortunate that I have parents who are willing to put up with me for that long.
Yeah.
And to support me in that way. I think if I was going to give any sort of suggestions or advice, I would say, while I know that there's a pressure to just apply for all the jobs that come up and sort of keep going, I think you do really need to consider, and I only realised this retrospectively through being at Newcastle, that you do need to consider whether the department you're trying to work with reflects your research aims and vice versa, whether your research is a good fit for them, because I think that's what encourages people to work with you, and that's what's more likely to get you longevity within a department, is if you can help the department fulfill their particular goals, but these goals also closely align with what you want to do in your personal research as well. I think that's the most important thing, and I think that's where I got lucky with Newcastle, because we have such an emphasis on doing research into areas of equality and diversity and inclusion through different forms of media, because we have colleagues working on topics like race and gender, and they all sort of tie in together with the kind of work that I do. So I think making sure you fit with the department and vice versa is the main one. If you can afford to take a bit of time to maybe cut back on a little bit of teaching to keep your research time, if you can, I think that's really important, especially if you're sort of like I was, trying to get a book out. And even if you can't afford to cut back on teaching, just have a sort of quite a strict plan of when you're going to try and do that research, even if it's at little bits at a time.
Yeah, well, I think you've been really good at protecting your research time and not putting off the difficult task of getting stuck into writing a book. That's like massively important. But you've also, whilst you've always made it clear that the research time that you've been allocated is obviously there as part of your the work and time, and you've been very, very clear about protecting it, you haven't shied away from, you know, developing your toolkits in other ways and learning other skills. So embracing the opportunity to teach on a couple of different programs, or to supervise students from a couple of different programs, or to take on an administrative role that helps you learn the ins and outs of how the department works, and to get a closer look at the, you know, the structural workings of the institution. I think that willingness to develop multiple skills whilst protecting the research time in the best way you can, I think that's really, really important.
A lot of weekends and evenings went into the book as well, which is, you know, as much as we try and protect the sort of 9 to 5 working hours, there was a lot of that.
No, it's. I think we don't want to be seen to be encouraged. Whilst we don't want to be seen to be encouraging people to work evenings and weekends, at the same time, there's a reality there where you have these, because we care about what we do as well. We like writing and we want to do the book and so on and so forth. There are periods where you have to, in many jobs, not just ours, where we put in that extra bit. And you don't want it to become a permanent feature of how you work because your employers relied upon you never having a life. But I do think the rewarded or the lucky thing about what we do is because we like it, we're willing to put in those hours for those periods where it really matters, and you get the rewards at the end.
I think it's the same with the marking periods as well, though. Like we don't spend our whole lives marking, but there are certain weeks of the year where we know it's going to be a bit of a tough one.
Yeah.
I think it's, like you say, it's temporary, and as long as we don't sort of cultivate or promote bad habits full time, I think a little bit of that's okay.
I think that's a really important point, actually, on things like marking and also teaching allocation. Early career researchers, or it's not that I shouldn't just put the emphasis on early career researchers, people who are responsible for managing teams and leading academic departments with early career researchers in should be really mindful of not overloading early career researchers with excessive amounts of teaching, really valuing their research space and their research time, giving them time early on in their career to develop in that respect, and also to be aware that, I mean, I always use the term bottlenecks. I don't want people suffering in silence about bottlenecks. I think as not just early career researchers, but I think as academics, we can sometimes get to these points where you kind of, the short-term pressure of a bottleneck is sometimes can feel overwhelming. You kind of don't want to say anything. I think we need to, as teams of academics, foster an environment where we feel comfortable to put our hands up and say, look, I'm not complaining. I'm not saying I've got too much overall, but this thing right now at this moment in time is just too much. I think we need to create the environment in which an early career researcher especially can feel that they can say that.
Yeah. I think that the issue as well is that the way the job market is and sort of how we learn about it, we're sort of conditioned to feel grateful for any work that we've got. So when you have these huge, and I think marking does fall disproportionately on ECRs in a lot of places. So when you have these huge volumes of marking as an ECR, you don't feel like you can say anything because you're grateful to have any form of contract at an institution. But what I've learned as I progressed is that everybody feels like that about those big bottleneck marking periods, and it's not a reflection on you not being able to do your job properly if you find it overwhelming.
Yeah, and I think managers have an ethical responsibility, and this is purely about trust really, but team leaders have an ethical responsibility to not make judgments about staff moving forward just because they've been willing to put their hand up and say something was too much at a certain period of the year. I think there's just, academic leaders need to be trusted to be ethical in that sense. And luckily we work somewhere where we're surrounded by nice people who aren't judgmental in that sense at Newcastle. So that's a massive advantage for us.
I don't think I would have progressed as well in some other institutions, I think, because I was very lucky that I came to Newcastle on an early career fellowship that had specific characteristics, and one of those was a sort of smaller proportion of teaching compared to a full-time lecturer. So my research time was protected as part of the role, and most of my teaching was related to my expertise and research interests. Which also in turn helped my research, because I find that when you have to teach topics and explain them to other people, it really clarifies what you think about them.
Yeah. And having the advantage of taking your research into the classroom and doing research-led teaching is one of the most rewarding parts of the job as well.
Yeah. My only other bit of advice would be just to have a clear plan for what you want to do, even if you don't end up achieving it. It's about showing that you know what you want to do, and you know that you can do it and how you're going to go about it.
Yeah, certainly. To have that plan, and also to not worry if the plan changes as well. At least have a plan to begin with and a sense of direction and purpose. And if those things change along the way, I think sometimes we can get too precious about how we think things have to go. If the plan changes, then think about why it's changed and see the positives in that, and try and respond to the reasons why, and just move with it. But yeah, despite everything we've said, I think the key thing is to try and relax and enjoy it the best you can, because it's a real privilege to do what we do.
Yeah, I think so.
I reckon we've run out of time.
Yeah.
But this is a really, really brilliant way to finish the first series of the podcast. Thank you for being a really great colleague.
Thank you.
And especially recently, with everything we've had to do, you've really stepped up and helped the team. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that while you're on here.
Thank you.
And maybe one day after this world of COVID, we may be back in the Crow's Nest in Newcastle having a pint. You never know. But for now, I'll say goodbye, and I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks. Speak to you soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.